Sorry, what?
Good. Toast. Toast.
See?
Toast.
It's good.
It is good.
Welcome to Medical Stuff. My name is Mark Frankham, and this young man over here is...
Chris Fingston.
We are both acting paramedics, or at least we act like paramedics.
Yeah, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're both paramedics in the 911 system in a county in Oregon.
That's actually fairly accurate. Act like paramedics. I'm going to say there's a good portion of my job which is really just acting.
Well, you are talking to two gentlemen when they worked together. Their first patient of the day, they decided who was going to treat the patient by playing Rochambeau.
Yeah, well, and I believe I won, but...
Once.
Yeah. We did that almost every day because we could never remember who took the last patient.
Right.
So...
Anyway, here today we're going to be talking about ICS, which is Incident Command System.
Mm-hmm.
And is also a part of NIMS, which is the...
National Incident Management System.
Right.
So we're going to do a little something new today. We're going to try something new, and that is we're going to talk a little bit about some headlining stories to kind of give a little bit of a scope of what we do and kind of how involved we are. And so today I kind of want to start off talk a little bit about the Manchester bombing. So as a lot of people know, there was a bombing in Manchester. It was after a concert. Concert goers were leaving the venue, and a suicide bomber was outside and detonated a bomb in the middle of a crowd. I believe 22 people are dead.
22 people plus him.
Yeah, plus him. And then there's I think it was about 114 injured, with 63 of those critical.
Yes.
And so, and then, yeah, it sounds
now, we
accurate.
were talking about the Manchester 2017 bombing, because there was one in 1996, I believe, in Manchester.
Oh, gotcha.
So,
no, we're referring to
the Ariana Grande concert.
Yeah, we're referring to the most recent event. And I believe they've arrested some 17 people now in connection with that.
I believe so. As of today's
at.
Recording, yes, they arrested the 17th person.
So, and as we kind of see these events pop up, we kind of want to show how EMS integrates into these events and what our role is, because it is more involved than just show up and start driving people away. There's a lot of considerations that take effect. How many resources did you say were on this? You said there were some 60 transports.
For transporting units, there were 60 units available. I didn't
60, yeah.
I didn't get how many fire engines or police officers or anything like that.
But there's going to be a ton of equipment there.
But there is a system in place and training in place. Now, what we're going to be talking today is going to be an Americanized version of this. If you're listening to this from other countries, they probably have something similar. It may not be exactly the same. Yeah.
But this is actually, this has gained a lot of international traction, especially amongst NATO countries.
Right.
Is kind of going out. So,
well, we've talked about in the past responding to a call.
Yeah.
When you have a call of this scope, you're talking 22 dead. Wow, masterful.
Continue.
Masterful. 22 dead, we're talking over 100 people injured.
Yeah.
As a system, you're going to be overwhelmed pretty much the entire time to varying degrees.
Mm-hmm.
But luckily, with the ICS command structure, this helps address exactly how stressed you are, because it gives you a definitive structure and very defined roles.
Yeah. And ICS stands for the Incident Command Structure. So the Incident Command Structure was actually developed, I want to say it was in the 90s or even before. It was in California, and it was to address wildfires. And they would have these wildfires that would require just mass amounts of resources, often from different jurisdictions that didn't necessarily work with each other.
Now, this is not running through a snowstorm looking for your horse kind of wildfire.
No, that totally is what I'm talking about.
Oh, okay.
No, right on par. But right, and so they did to address the wildfires. But then after 9/11, after the September 11th attacks, then President George Bush charged his staff with coming up with a national response, a unified response across the nation to address large events. And that was the birth of NIMS. Should we start that bit over and cut out? Or okay, I'll cut that part out.
Yeah.
And the silence. I'll cut the silence out. I'll probably cut.
the silence.
I'm going to cut that out, I think.
Probably a good idea.
No, I mean, who knows? So,
Unless we're going with a Rick and Morty episode.
No, it could be.
Yeah. But you don't like Rick and Morty because you're lame.
I haven't watched Rick and Morty.
Well, still lame. Anyway, this is all being cut out.
Yeah.
So, Instant Command Structure, George Bush, go.
Okay, gotcha. So George Bush went ahead and commissioned his people to come up with a national response, and that what ended up being NIMS, which is the National Incident Management System. So the difference between NIMS and ICS is that NIMS encompasses essentially getting ICS out nationally. How I'm going to phrase that better. NIMS...
It's the training that goes into implementation.
I should stop drinking beer. I don't know if it helps me.
NIMS is what trains the implementation and the recertification of the providers.
Yeah, NIMS is the management system that sets ICS as a standard, and that includes all the support up to. That's training. It's managed by FEMA currently. Mm-hmm. That's training. That's preparation. That's drills.
And anybody can become ICS 100 and 700 certified.
You just go to FEMA's website.
Just go to FEMA's website, and you can run the class. It's the 100 class says is about 3 hours.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember how long. The 700 I think is actually shorter.
The 700 is more in depth. I found the 700 much longer.
You're not very smart, though.
That's
so
true.
that's right.
True.
So it could be that. It's a hard word to get rid of. So how does this play out as we respond to a call? So initially, when we're going to get the 911 calls, especially in an event like this, we're going to get flooded with 911 calls. So Mark, with your dispatch experience, can you talk a little bit about how a flood of calls would be handled?
Well, one of the problems is that you will overflow the number of callers that you have, or the call takers that you have. So you have to kind of set up an initial triage system where you have 1 or 2 people taking the initial calls and getting as much information as you can.
And that might vary agency to agency. I'd imagine it's going to vary.
Well, it's going to vary. How many people you have doing that varies on how many people you have to do call taking.
Got you that. And is this going to...
The city of Manchester, I'm sure, probably has a very large 999 system, which is the emergency number in England. Is 999 instead of 911.
So, however, though, can this, and this is just my question, can this interrupt 911 service?
Well, yes.
Or 999 service?
What happened? Well, once you overwhelm the number of call takers, then you're going to have some sort of answering service, automated answering service, controlling the flow of calls. Yeah. And so if this is going on, and then somebody else is having a heart attack somewhere else in town, it's going to be harder for them to get, which I'm not faulting anybody for this. It's just going to be harder for that person to get through and get help. And there may be a delayed response to them because of taxation of resources.
Yeah. And actually resources is kind of the main point here. ICS is employed whether or not you have the resources available. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between like an MPS and an MCI, which is kind of moot now.
Right.
And we'll kind of go from there. So when we first get these calls, we're going to see an activation of resources. And the first thing that's going to get set up is the incident command structure.
And this is going to start with the first arriving vehicle.
Yeah, so the first arriving vehicle essentially takes command. So the incident command structure is broken down. There's a helpful mnemonic for that, and that's CFLOP. And what it is C is for command, and that's going to involve your incident commander. The incident commander is going to set the goals for the scene. And then after that, you're going to include, you're going to have like your PIO is actually part of command. And then from there, they're going to break up into several other branches, and that's where the FLOP comes in. And that stands for finance, logistics, operations, and planning. Now, Mark and I can probably talk more to the operations branch going down because that's where we participate more. That's where a lot of your action's happening. That's where fire resources are being deployed, patients are being treated and transported.
Also, and not all of the FLOP part are going to be implemented in every scene.
No,
and a number of scenes, depending on the size of it and the scope.
Yeah,
in fact, financing, logistics, planning aren't going to be implemented.
Yeah,
and the reason being is that those are more of a Katrina style, Hurricane Katrina style, where you have long term. Absolutely, and that's really where you're also getting more into the ICS 700, where you're going to be having to bring in bulldozers or.
So, in fact, I'm going to say the majority of your ICS scenes is going to be command and operations.
Yeah.
That's what you can anticipate.
And that's what we're going to be focusing on today.
Right. So once command is set up, they're going to go ahead and...
Well, they're going to initiate the first steps of arrival.
Yeah.
They're going to establish command. They're going to give an initial scene size up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in this type of a bombing situation, I won't specifically speak like I know what I'm talking about with Manchester because I wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
But you would pull up. You would note that you have multiple victims down. You have people in panic, and that you're initiating your command structure. Now, the first person on scene does not end up being usually the ultimate commander of the scene.
No,
that can be passed on at a face-to-face to incoming units.
Yeah. So, Jesus Christ. I keep saying
I know.
It's hard.
It's hard to hear. Once you realize it,
Really
it's hard to unhear.
And then I just end up being silent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because then you pissed off at yourself for saying again. Oh, man, dude, that class ruined me for life, I tell you.
No, I know, seriously. God, it even made you speak better. I have to listen to you more. So, right.
So, yeah, the initial...
This is actually also a good part in which a scene might be declared an MCI or MPS, depending on where you're at. MCI is mass casualty incident. A lot of people are used to that acronym. MPS is multiple patient scene.
It's usually a smaller scene.
Yeah. And so we used to have some arbitrary numbers in there. Like an MPS was this many patients and an MCI was this many patients.
For us, it was a 2 to 9 MPS.
Yeah.
And this would be a bad car wreck.
Right.
You know, and then MCI was 10 or more.
Mm-hmm. And now what they've kind of changed this to is basically you're going to be using those terms when the number of patients, or basically the task at hand, is overwhelming the resources you have available in your immediate jurisdiction. That's when you're going to be talking about these terms. So it doesn't necessarily have to have that arbitrary number. I mean, if you're out, say in a rural area and they have a bunch of calls going, you could have a car accident that maybe only has 2 or 3 patients. But if the only resources you have available are not necessarily enough to handle those 2 to 3 patients, you may at that point decide this is an MPS. Whereas if you had the resources, you probably wouldn't.
Right.
So once that's set up and command is set up, they will set up the operations branch. Each branch has its own leader. So the command branch has the commander. That's the leader basically over the entire event. And then the operations branch will have an operations chief. You might call it something different depending on jurisdictions and agencies, but there's someone running that branch. Underneath that branch, you're going to have medical. And underneath medical, you're going to have transport.
And triage.
And triage.
And
Actually,
treatment.
And treatment. Actually, let's talk about triage. You want to talk about triage?
Here in just a second.
Sure.
So now, one of the things about ICS and why it's such an effective tool is that it dictates resources down to the fact of how many people are answering to you.
Right.
So you're going to have anywhere between 3 to 7 people underneath you as, say, the medical branch officer.
Right.
Once you get to 7 in one particular branch, say if I had 7 people underneath me, I would then dedicate two of those people to take over different parts. So I may have one person doing treatment and transport and the other person doing triage. Mm-hmm. And then they would have people underneath them. And you never have more than 7 people under you because they found that becomes overwhelming at that point.
It's too many direct reports.
Right.
It's too much information to keep track of.
And also the flow of information, you don't skip a command level. So
No.
Your treatment paramedic is not going to be talking to instant command. He's going to be talking to the treatment commander. The treatment commander will talk to the medical branch commander. Medical branch commander will talk to instant command.
Operations.
Operations. And then...
Then it's it. Don't skip,
and
Mark.
that is so that not everybody is attacking the instant commander or the operations commander, and it would fall apart. Mm-hmm. Your structure would fall apart at that point.
Absolutely. That's why it's set up the way it is. So triage.
Triage. Initial triage is very important, but you also have to do follow-up triage.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, triage comes from where?
France.
France. Mm-hmm. It's from France. It means
to sort.
Choose. Or to sort.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's triagi, and it's taught
I can't wait
by
to
a
do this.
small Japanese man who's a martial arts expert. And then it's triagi by Mr. Miyagi.
So that's actually what we're talking about today. So the important thing is your first responders need to wax off. It's follow-up responders that will do the wax on. Now,
Right.
which seems backwards.
Right.
But
You
no.
got to clear the area. No, anyway, triage is
This
going
is-
out and just counting the number of patients and then giving an initial assessment, basic assessment of what?
Well, so there's a few different mnemonics out there for triage, but one of the more common ones is start with RPM. So what that means, so START is, what is that? Is it simple treatment and rapid transport?
Right.
Or it's simple triage and rapid treatment is actually
Yes.
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 And the mnemonic with that is RPM. That stands for respirations, pulse, and mental status. What we're trying to do is we're just assigning a priority to the patient. And those priorities are going to be green, yellow, red, and then black. Just a brief thing. Greens are people who are going to be last in line, possibly not even, likely not even transported, or transported en masse by bus.
At the Manchester bombing, there was a hotel just up the road that offered their facilities for people that were green, basically.
Perfect. That's great.
At worst, this is going to be your walking wounded.
Right.
The hardest part about the green zone is keeping everybody there
because they can walk,
so they can be accounted for and possibly interviewed by the police.
It was actually, I can't even remember the event. Well, there was an event where one of the examples came out as they actually found people, and these are actually pretty crappy people when I think about this, that what they were doing. So the way the triage tags are is they have these little rip along the dotted line. You actually tag people with these tags, see what color they are. Well, there was an event where people figured out that if they wanted to be seen sooner, all they had to do was rip the green off and they were a yellow.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, people were doing that. Which that's a crappy kind of person who's like...
Well, yeah, because we have made you a green for a reason. We've made these people yellow for a reason. So green, like Chris said, we're walking wounded.
Yeah, so your yellows... I actually talk about yellows next, because yellows are essentially people who aren't green and aren't red when you follow down that card.
Right.
So your reds are people who need immediate attention, but a key point is not only do they need immediate attention, they actually have a decent chance of surviving.
Well, these are going to be people with non-life-threatening cuts.
I'm talking about reds.
Oh, reds are. Well, you said you're going to do yellows next.
No, I said I was going to skip yellows.
No, you didn't.
Yeah, I did. I said I'm going to skip yellows for now. You never listened to me, Mark.
Back of the tape.
We don't need to do that. So anyway, because it's probably going to prove me wrong.
Okay. Reds.
So we're on reds, and the reason I'm skipping yellows is because yellows essentially fall into you're either if you're not green and you're not red or black, you're yellow. So let's talk a little bit about reds. So reds are your people who have substantial injuries, but it is still viable that with the resources you could have a positive outcome. You could have a positive.
You have a reasonable expectation of survival.
Exactly. And so those people are going to be prioritized next. And then if anyone who does not fit into those categories, so they're not walking wounded, but they're not critical, but they still need treatment, those are going to be labeled as yellow. They're delayed.
Now, these people may, depending on the severity of the reds, these people may have fractures.
Absolutely.
They may have lacerations, but generally your reds are going to be your patients that are unconscious but are still breathing.
Yeah.
That's kind of where or they have such severe injuries that without rapid transport to a hospital or facility that can treat those, they're going to die.
Yeah. And then after that, you have the black, which is essentially this person has been deceased. Now, the blacks actually pose a substantial challenge for EMS on scene, especially when you have family members around. Because I'll tell you this much, you good? Okay. I'll tell you this much, every family member that's there, they want the best chance for their family member, but you have to move on. When we look at patients, we are looking at... we're very literally taking our resources and applying them where they're going to be most effective. And someone who's not going to make it, and this is dead or dying, note. This is not someone who's obviously dead. This is dead or dying.
Well, the way I was always taught was you check for respirations.
Actually,
if they're not breathing, you open their airway to see if they have spontaneous respirations.
And that is at the start of the start.
This is your initial... Yeah. This is your initial triage. If they do not have spontaneous respirations, you tag them as black and you move on.
Yeah. After opening the airway.
And
that's it. And the thing is even someone who's not having respirations, they may still be even generating a pulse at that point if their heart has not quite died. But you move on because you have limited resources. And the chances of that person benefiting from your resources over taking it away from someone who's maybe a red.
Right.
Who
is breathing and...
Right.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is something that bothers emergency providers.
Right.
As much as we talk about it, we talk about it in a very clinical manner, it's not easy. Why? We get into this industry because we want to save people. But there comes a point in these situations where you have to save the greatest number. And it's not that if you gain the resources that you wouldn't go back and double check on this patient, but generally during your initial triage, you just don't have time. 22 people dead, 114 alive in Manchester. So, you do the best you can. It's not meant to be cold-hearted. It's not meant to be anything to diminish those people. It's just that I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
Yeah, and I think that's really hard for responders, because if this was the only patient there, we'd be all in trying to save this person, but you got to write them off. And the other thing that's hard too is it's not just patients we see, and this is kind of one of the things that, because if you are a paramedic, or if you've ever become, or if you plan on being a paramedic, if you haven't already, you will be asked sooner or later, how do you handle the dead people? And my response is this: I've never been dead. I can't relate. But lots of people have lost somebody, myself included. Mm-hmm. And I can relate to family members. And that's what gets me more than dead people. So when you're on scene and family members, you're not just on scene witnessing a horrible event. You're on scene and people are looking to you to fix it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And it's hard to walk away. Mm-hmm. I'm fortunate. In my career, I've never had to walk away quite like that on like an MCI. I have had to tell plenty of people, look, I'm sorry, they're beyond help.
Right.
But, there's more resources there. There's time to explain. The death is usually more obvious. Right. I've never been in the situation on an MCI where I've had to be like, look, I know.
Right.
But I got to move on.
Right. And again, so your first responding unit has 4 people on it. Say it's a fire engine.
Sure.
One person establishes command.
Yep.
One person starts triage, maybe 2. They start counting people and they start triaging. One of those people is going to have to start setting up a treatment area. And then very quickly, you're going to have to start thinking about transport. And that's probably going to fall on the commander initially.
Yeah.
Because not only do you have to think about how many patients you have to think about how we're going to get the resources in and out of the scene effectively. Because it is not uncommon, I've had this happen, I'm sure Chris has, you pull up on scene, you start treating your patient, you go to your ambulance and you're blocked in by people who've shown up beyond you. And now you can't leave. And you can't find the people whose cars or vehicles are behind you. So you have to set up, do you want 60 ambulances on this scene at one time?
No, that's where you start setting up staging areas.
Right, but this is so as more resources are brought in, this is where you'll see the incident command structure expand.
Right.
You will have your medical branch, which has a transport person, and that's all they do, and they're keeping track of where vehicles are going, and they take patients' initials, and they keep track of what the hospitals can handle, because it doesn't help sending 115 people to the closest hospital because they won't be able to handle that load, so you have to determine where these people are going.
And that's where a lot of these classes start talking about, it doesn't do anybody any good just to transfer the MCI to another location, which is what you'd be doing if you suddenly flooded your local hospital. Right. The patient's getting no help sitting there waiting. So at that point, like in our area, we have a medical resources hospital we contact that starts determining destinations in an MPS.
And they may seem like they're excessively far away, but that's because you're trying to take patients, you're trying to even the workload.
Well, and adding 20 minutes in the back of an ambulance with a team of people who are caring for that patient is better than somebody waiting 20 minutes with no one that can bother to look at them right now.
Or longer.
Or much longer.
It could be longer. So on top of the on-scene medical concept, you have to worry about other things.
Lots of other things, yeah.
In this situation, you had an explosive device go off, and it was a nail bomb. You had it full of nuts and bolts, so it's going to be a shrapnel type bomb. Is there another bomb?
Yep.
It's a very common tactic to blow up a secondary bomb when the first responders arrive.
So, and you bring up a good point, because scene safety. So one of the things you'll probably hear us talk about from time to time on this show is going to be scene safety. And that's kind of something I'll actually back up a little bit. One of the first things we determine, or the first responder is going to determine, is scene safety. Mm-hmm. And that is ingrained in EMS.
Day one of the first class.
Absolutely. In fact, when you're going through training in EMS, you have these skill sheets on basically how to do a procedure or an operation or run a call. And they all begin with
BSI, scene safe.
BSI is body substance isolation. That's your gloves, your mask, those
During
kind of
class,
things.
You'll wake up with night sweats, blurting that out as you come to.
I was actually in paramedic school while I was getting married at the same time, and I swear to God, I was going to end up on that, getting married, and I'm just going to be like, all right, BSI and Scene Safe, number of fiancés, 1. So that was that's where
That
I was
was
gonna...
actually Chris's vows when it was, you know.
It was.
But no, I mean, you
I haven't hit a
have
critical
your
fail.
first incoming unit arrive. They want to, if they're, you know, if we're, especially if you're medically trained, police have a different priority when they get on scene. Do they care about people? Absolutely. But they're going to be worried about secondary devices. And even the fire department, who are probably medically trained in your area, have to worry about other things like structural problems.
Fuel leaks.
This bomb has gone off inside a building.
Oh, yeah.
There's still people inside the building. Do you send people in to help when the building's structurally unsound? What if the building collapses or part of the building collapses?
Because the end point is that if you lose responders who are responding, you make the situation much worse.
Well, not only do you not have those responders to recycle back to the scene, but you now have more patients.
Absolutely. More people to take care of. And so so you're right, it's exponential when you start losing responses.
So it's not, I mean, so when we talk about having to have taxed resources or having a black patient that we're not going to be able to treat at this point, and maybe family on scene that are going to have a hard time understanding that, it's not just medical care and we don't have enough responders. It's medical care, it's police, it's structural integrity. Chris mentioned a gas leak. Did we rupture a gas line and that's now causing that? So your secondary explosion isn't intentional, but it's secondary to the explosion because of something else that's gone on. So there is a massive scope of things that are going on in a very short period of time.
Yeah. And that's... Gosh, where do we go now?
Well, I mean, as it expands, so you will actually expand out from your initial group, and as you get more resources on scene, you will actually start treating your yellows right there on scene. You can send up...
Just be careful of the karate chops. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
they're on shock mounts, but they're not. They're
But-
cheap.
So you're there. You can actually set up treatment areas. Like I said, there was a hotel down the road
Yep.
that took in people that were green. But you're going to have a yellow area. When we get there, we break open what's called an MCI kit. In this kit, you're going to have tags. It's going to have a couple of dry erase boards or grease boards.
Yep.
That you can use to track patients. Because one of the things you need to do while you're doing all of this other stuff and you're thinking about all this other stuff is keeping track of patients. How many reds do I have? How many yellows do I have? How many greens do I have? Where are they? Where are they going?
Mm-hmm. How many are going to go in each ambulance?
Right.
How are we transporting these people off? We had an MPS very recently with a motor vehicle incident. Now, it ended up not being an MPS after that, but initially we said 10 patients. Mm-hmm. So our immediate plan was we called MRH and we said we have 1 going by air. We're going to have 3 in each of the 3 responding ambulances. They're all greens, but we are going to load down these ambulances. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to have 3 in each responding ambulances, so we needed 3 destinations.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard instances where they bring in a bus to bring the greens to the hospital because they still need to be checked out because they're walking. And they probably aren't wounded. They still need to be checked. Because even if there's not a physical damage there, there's a psychological damage there that needs to be addressed.
Well, and earlier you had mentioned that you do an initial triage, but re-triage is going to be something that we're going to have to consider as well. Because green patients, injuries get worse when not treated. So someone who was yellow can be red, and someone who's green can be yellow.
Perfect example would be a shockwave injury that may not present itself initially.
Absolutely. It's going to be a lot of internal injuries that you might not see immediate bleeding.
But someone may start developing signs of a concussion.
Absolutely. Or, hey, I'm walking fine. I got some abdominal pain, but I'm okay. And they're walking around. All right, cool. You're green. Now all of a sudden they're, face down in the nearby field. You might have a red patient.
You may have a red patient. Yellows can very easily become red. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, depending on your resource utilization that you have, reds can become blacks.
Yeah.
So
the the overarching goal is to get people to definitive care as quick as possible. And
they have definitive airways.
No. So that's the overarching goal, is to get people off the scene into definitive care as quick as possible. And ICS just helps us keep things in perspective. The initial knee-jerk reactions are what can kill a scene, and by having ICS, that allows us to have a uniform, consistent approach, and it takes into account things like, don't flood everyone to one hospital, because getting them off the scene quickly to go somewhere else to wait
stage your
isn't going to help.
transport units down the block until you have an area where they can get in and get out easily and quickly.
And this also allows commanders to not be overtaxed by having one person trying to lead a giant scene and having things broken down.
Now, there are scenes where you're going to be there for weeks or months.
Certainly.
And that's where your ICS 700 comes in. Because and that's where your finance, your logistics, your planning. Because you think of finance, okay, so great, to help with this incident, we now need, well, let's take the Manchester bombing.
Yeah.
There was an underground station right below that was attached to the stadium.
Yes, true.
They had to shut it down.
Yeah.
Because of structural integrity problems, potential secondary devices. This is an access point where other people, if he were working with other people, and they still haven't fully determined that,
right?
They could have been down there waiting.
Well, considering they're at 17 arrests right now,
right?
You know,
but the thing is that so people flood down into the subway station to get away from the initial bombing, and there's somebody waiting down there. You know,
right?
But okay, so we need to now finance the repairing of the station. We need to finance the people we're going to be keeping on scene. They're going to have to be fed. They're going to have to be housed. Your long-term workers. You're going to have to, bring in, as much as in the minute, people are more than willing to help out. This hotel, I'm sure, taxed their resources tremendously and possibly called in people to help out. They're going to want to pay those people for that time.
Yes.
Absolutely. And they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but they still have to be able to at least recoup cost.
And now expand that out to something like Katrina.
Right.
Now start thinking about the number of resources you're having in terms of housing the homeless, Red Cross.
Housing the paramedics and the police officers and the firefighters you brought in from all over the nation to help.
We sent people all the way over to Katrina. Katrina. And that was one of the things. And then talk about planning. I think that's where a planning branch really comes in. One of the big roles of planning is actually so after the initial patients are taken care of, what next? And events like Katrina and the Manchester bombing, that's a huge project. In fact, you'll spend probably more time and more money on the what next than you would the initial scene. Hurricane Katrina is the perfect example of that.
Absolutely.
And they're also going to worry about, so how do we demobilize? So we've got all these resources out. Why do we demobilize? And there's going to be a lot of things in demobilization. What demobilization means, it sounds like, all right, well, everyone goes home and stops. But that's not true. You still have apparatus and equipment that needs to go back, but it also needs to be prepped and ready for the next call. You're going to have equipment that's missing. How do you get that equipment there to get those units back in service? What do you do for the responders that were there and witnessed this?
Absolutely.
And so you've got a lot of back end stuff that has to happen. And actually, I'm going to take a little bit of time to point out something. And so first of all, Mark and I, actually most paramedics, but definitely Mark and I, we're the last people to ever really describe ourselves as heroes.
Well, if you saw us, you'd understand why. So
yeah.
We definitely are not the Clark Kent Superman-esque.
Yeah. But, and we also understand that a large portion of our job is not really spent in the Department of Heroics. But to a certain extent, if you think about anybody else in any other job, if you were there and a bomb blew up, you pretty much get a freebie for that day. I mean, imagine if you worked at a department store, maybe in, lingerie, and a bomb blows up in your department store. Very unlikely your manager's going to come back and say, hey, I knew a bomb blew up, but you put the silk underwear next to the plaid underwear, and we're going to need to improve that. But now let's look at EMS. Let's look at 9/11. That was a huge event. A lot of responders died. A lot of people died. Yet, even after that, as much as we support our responders, we still look, okay, guys, how are we going to improve this next time? Mm-hmm. And that is kind of the quality you have to have in someone that's in EMS, is they have to be able to not only respond to the event when everyone else has basically carte blanche to not be there. Mm-hmm. They then have to keep going after that. And then they have to be willing, at least in our system here in the U.S., and I know it's as well abroad, they have to be willing to accept some criticism after that to improve.
Well, I mean, after an incident, immediately after an incident, a lot of times you're going to have what's called a hot wash.
Yeah.
Which is where everybody has not left the scene. We haven't had time to really digest it, but we're going to go over it.
Yeah. And that's part of what we call a CISD, or critical incident stress debriefing.
And there's no finger pointing at these things.
No.
This is legitimately, what did you see? What did you do? And this is going to be manifested by two groups of people. And that's going to be the commanders of the departments. And it's also going to be by trained professionals to help people deal with the emotional stress. This is something that's becoming more and more prevalent in EMS.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the short-term and long-term psychological effects of seeing the things that emergency services people see. Be a police officer, firefighter, paramedic, EMT, whatever. You see death and mayhem throughout your career. Maybe not every day, but you still see some pretty horrific things.
You do.
And so you're going to have your hot wash where everybody goes over the basics. And then afterwards, you're going to have what's called a cold briefing.
Yeah.
And this is a day, 2 week later where people get back together and they start combing through and looking at how things went. And it legitimately is just or the primary purpose of it is to prepare for the next event much better. What can we learn from this? How can we improve? What worked? What didn't work? So, yes, you have your initial response of the bombing.
Mm-hmm.
You have your initial response of your first responders. You have your treatment and transport of 100 plus people. But then you also have 60 crews on the ambulances, untold number of firefighters, untold number of police officers in the middle of the scene.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget the ERs.
Let's not forget the ERs, absolutely.
Yeah.
But these people can all be affected dramatically by these events. And so we have to make sure that those people are taken care of. So now you have a couple hundred more people, and those people are affected in different manners. What may affect Chris may not affect me.
Right.
It helps that I have no heart, so not much affects me.
Mark is tougher than me. I'm sensitive.
That's not true. But, this is something that even after the events and the heroes that helped out, be it emergency services, be it people who took risks, private citizens who took risks
right
at the scene. Once everybody gets to the hospital and the investigation's done and the place returns to normal operations, you're still not done at that point.
No.
So, Instant Command, if you want to check out anything else on the Instant Command structure, you can go to FEMA's Facebook page. I'm sorry, you can go to FEMA's webpage.
I don't know if they have a Facebook page.
They probably do. It's 2017. But anyway, you can go to their webpage and anybody can take these classes.
And by the way, that is FEMA.gov.
Yes. Make sure it's .gov. Anytime you're talking about a government website, go to a .gov.
Yeah, .coms can lead you to all sorts of funny places.
There was a time when WhiteHouse.com was a porn site.
Yes, it was.
So, some very interesting civics papers coming out of some middle schools that people went to the wrong website. But
I thought we were doing history. This looks more like A&P.
Exactly. So, there's a lot of information here, and it's not just run in, run around, scream a bit, and get out of there. There's a very long process that goes along with it, a lot of training.
And I guess that was the point I was trying to get at, is it's in these incidents, it's very easy to be like, man, that was rough, let's move on. But in EMS, it's like, man, that was rough, how do we do it better?
For many decades, let's move on. That's done, forget about it, don't worry about it, was the mentality. And there are so many studies out there now showing that that's not done yet. We need to make sure that our first responders are being taken care of.
Absolutely. Well, I think I'm out of shit to say. Or I think I'm out of stuff to say.
Ain't lifting stuff, Chris.
Ain't lifting stuff.
My name's Mark Frankham.
And I am Chris Fingston.
And we are Medical Stuff.
Bye.
Toast.